Morning, everybody. How we doing today? My name is Dan. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. We've had some great new blood in the comments section lately. I appreciate some of the new commentary we're getting. It's very valuable and appreciated. And I'm glad people dig some of the historical context and crossover that this channel tries to present. We don't try to limit it just to music in that perspective. We try to put its context in its place in the world. Today we're going to talk about a guy who doesn't get nearly the love or credit he deserves. And as much credit as Ornette Coleman gets, and certainly as much credit as John Coltrane gets, and Miles Davis for that matter as well, even though a different instrument, there's a guy who's been an innovative player on the saxophone dating back to the early 50s, who's a brilliant composer and arranger. A lot of people did his arrangements. He was really kind of focused and central on the West Coast scene, and he kind of gets, I think, lumped in with that cool West Coast sound, but he was so much more modern and the edges of the avant-garde, and pushes a lot of development in the music rather unheralded. And we're talking about Jimmy Giuffre. It looks like Giuffre, but it's pronounced Joffrey from what I can tell. A good Italian name. He's from Dallas, Texas. His father was born in Sicily and came to America, born in a city called Termini Imerese in Sicily. So there's a great lineage there with the Italian immigration to America, of course, in the 20th century. I just have found myself over the last few years, as I've dug into Joffre's career more and more into his records, even his side work, and even other people doing his arrangements. I've always found myself walking away, why does this guy get more light shed on him? Why aren't people more cognizant of him? And I think in this case, it's actually a bit of a case of reverse racism, where because he's white and associated with the cool initially, he's not really given the regards that many of his contemporaries, who in a lot of ways he seems to be ahead of. We're going to kind of compare some of where he's at with Coltrane, who gets so much credit, and most of it's worthy and due. Coltrane's, of course, a giant luminary in this field. But Giuffre, if you listen to even what we're playing right here, that bright, aggressive, intense, searching quality, that's Coltrane. But we're listening to Jimmy Giuffre. Make no mistake about it. He starts off arranging for Woody Herman's Heard, and the Four Brothers is a song he wrote that was a reference to the saxophone section at that time. I believe Al Cohn's, Lit Sims, Serge Chaloff was part of that at times. The membership of that changes over the years, but that became kind of a standard in the songbooks. He's definitely affiliated with that West Coast scene. He's working with Howard Rumsey and the Lighthouse All-Stars. That's in Los Angeles in the early 50s, 51, 52, 53. Those Howard Rumsey All-Star records are inventive, explosive, high-tempo, dynamic, cool. And it's not the cool of a Brubeck or even a Chico Hamilton. That stuff's really, as aggressive as white jazz is, aside from a few things that kind of spring from that group of musicians. It's very, like I said, up-tempo, filled with dynamics and as much blues as these guys were capable of. It's really fantastic stuff. He works with Rumsey from 51 to 53, and of course the Rumsey All-Stars pretty much houses most of the great white West Coast, and some of the black ones as well. Max Roach is there for a while. Other cats come through the lineup. He ends up working with Shorty Rogers a lot, the great trumpet player, who was also a great arranger and a great voice in the Rumsey All-Stars and the other West Coast big band, Stan Kenton, Woody Herman, that whole scene. Rogers ends up going solo with Shorty Rogers and his Jazz Giants, and of course Giuffre kind of goes with him initially, and then Jimmy Giuffre ends up going out on his own. And in 55, he makes a record that's really years ahead of the curve. I'm going to show it to you. And it's just called Tangents in Jazz. And I believe the great Jack Sheldon's on this on trumpet. who was a great kind of unheralded player who plays with Tom Waits later in his career. This record is brimming with modernity, edges of the avant-garde, dissonance, resolution. It just has a lot of the compositional tools ingrained in it. Some of Monk, some of Mingus, and even Mingus is like, these guys are young on the scene as well. And Giuffre on the West Coast is doing some, and I don't think a black man could have made this record on Capitol in 1955. A white guy, we're going to give a little more leeway and license to, and it's a really interesting record that is, like I said, years ahead of Change of the Century and Giant Steps and a lot of the modernity that's going to come in the next 5, 6, 7 years. This Tangents and Jazz record is really a precursor to, and Giuffre was definitely getting noticed. A lot of the great black musicians were using Giuffre's charts and arrangements, doing his compositions. Him and Mulligan both had a pretty big impact and a halo that they cast. He ends up working at a number of labels. The one off at Capitol here, which comes as a 10-inch first, and then this with a couple additional tracks. But then he goes to Atlantic, and he makes a string of great records at Atlantic, 1238 with the clarinet. He starts off very much on the tenor and baritone sax, but ends up in the alto and the clarinet, and I think he even plays the flute at times. This is the Jimmy Giuffre 3. Jim Hall's in that lineup there. The Music Man. Again, he's such an innovative cat. Traveling Light, the Jimmy Giuffre 3 again, a little trio. This is with Bob Brookmeyer now replacing the bass player. So you have guitar, trombone, and clarinet, which is not a very common alignment for a trio to have. This is the four brothers, Jimmy Giuffre, and of course that's all him there. And those sax players do some pieces together at RCA and on the Vic label, which is an RCA subsidiary. So that Four Brothers thing had quite a bit of staying power, and those guys were winning all the jazz polls back in the mid-50s. Those white musicians were very popular and sold well. This is a historic jazz concert at the Music Inn with a lot of players on it, but Giuffre, Teddy Charles, Pee Wee Russell, Dick Katz, Herbie Mann, Oscar Pettiford. Quite a lineup of musicians on that. This is 1298. It's one of the last records in the 1200 series at Atlantic. And the 1330, we have the Western Suite, which again has some very modern. Brookmeyer and Jim Hall again are the trio on that. It's not really West Coast cool. It's not really a part of a sound. He has his own thing going on. This is probably from 56, maybe 57 on the Savoy label. And they do two of these, the Jazz Composers Workshop. One of them has Mingus and the other guy escapes my mind. There's two different sides on this, and Conti Condoli, Shorty Rogers, Giuffre's on one side, but Giuffre's on both sides because he's on the B side. Well, no, sorry, he's not. Bill Roos was on the second side. But this first group here, again, modern stuff that Savoy's documenting. And then he goes to Verve, and it kind of opens the doors for him in a way. Atlantic was actually a great label for not interfering much with what you want to do. But Verve has even bigger distribution, and by this point it feels like his Verve stuff's more out there. The Atlantic stuff's gotten kind of expensive, probably the $40 to $80 range. The Verve stuff's probably more in the $25 to $50 range, although a few of those Verve titles can go for $100, the ones that are really sought after. He has a quite big body of work at Verve. He's at Atlantic from 56 to 58 or so he has a lot of stuff he does there. And he goes to Verve from 59 to 61. And he ends up having a trio with Paul Bly and the bass player, I can't remember right now. But they make some really edgy modern records. It's 59, 60, 61. And what I want to play here, again, that sounds so much like Coltrane. And even how he's kind of darting between kind of dissonance and resolution, looking for some edges, some things to polish. You know, you look for that rough crystal and you want to shine it up. And that's Coltrane. Yet Coltrane's not doing this yet. You know, in 59, Coltrane's kind of left Prestige behind. The Blue Note record, of course, is in his rearview mirror by this point. He's gone to Atlantic, and Giant Steps is on the horizon. It's all part of that whole development. But Giuffre feels like he's kind of an uncredited source for a lot of inspiration in jazz. And if you listen to one of Coltrane's first recordings at Atlantic, he's playing with the great Milt Jackson. And of course, Milt is one of the bluesiest R&B Detroit-born players in the music. And so, in a way, Milt Jackson's kind of putting a bridle on Coltrane and saying, "Nah, son, let's keep it inside the lines." And you feel Coltrane kind of chomping at the bit, but he's still kind of respecting his senior player, knowing that Milt has quite the pedigree. And Milt is not to be confused with the modern jazz quartet, because the MJQ was more a John Lewis thing that Milt was obviously a part of for decades, but that was very much chamber music, very much third stream, trying to elucidate sounds of Europe and classical engrafted into the sounds of jazz. And Milt played with John Lewis for, like I said, decades, but that whole time Milt's doing records on his own. And Milt's side work is just rooted in the blackest, most gospel-tinged blues you can imagine. And here he is at Atlantic, sidled with this young John Coltrane that Atlantic is just signed. And they record this session, and Atlantic actually sits on it for a couple of years before they issue it in '61. But you can hear Coltrane here in this setting. And if anything, he hasn't developed as far as Giuffre has in his percussive natures, in his blurting, his even squeaking and honking. Giuffre's doing that stuff. Way ahead of Albert Ayler, way ahead of Archie Shepp, ahead of Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane. Jimmy Giuffre's a very important person at the avant-garde. And a lot of times what they were doing in 59, 60, 61 was kind of what's considered a calm, beautiful storm of the avant-garde and a precursor to it. And he ends up going to Europe and doing some very modern things over there. Bassist was Steve Swallow in that Paul Bly, Jimmy Giuffre trio setting. He works with Jim Hall and a bass player by the name of Ralph Pena, and they do what he called the blues-based folk jazz. And what that's in a sense saying is this is black music imprinted on white traditions. So composition and arrangement and the elements of composition, dissonance and harmony and melody and rhythm, all these constructs, we're going to tear at the foundations of them and restructure them and bend them all in interesting and complex ways. And he was so revered by his peers, his musician peers. And even the critics were always kind of challenged and enjoyed what he did. How much success he had, it's hard to gauge. Those Atlantic records are out there, but not super easy to find. The Verve stuff from 59, 60, 61, there's probably fewer titles in that era that are more desired at the Verve label than the Jimmy Giuffre stuff. We're listening to right now Jimmy Giuffre and Quartet in person. And it's a nice record. I just actually got this one quite recently. And just listening to it, it just kind of stirred my soul. I'm like, I need to talk about Jimmy Giuffre. And I really think he deserves to have more light shed on him. He ends up making a record at Columbia in like 1962 called Free Fall. And it was just the precursors of free jazz in '62. And there was a report I read where they were playing a show at probably a nightclub, and the proceeds of their set was 35 cents a piece. Even with modern inflation, that probably translates to what, $8 a piece? Not a good pay for a night's work. So they actually disbanded the group and went their own different directions. And he ends up making records for a long time. He's at Columbia for a little while. Canada, he makes a couple of great records. He goes to Soul Note He stays in the scene for a long time, and he's one of the most highly regarded white jazz musicians out there. Yet his records don't fetch the prices of the Ornette Colemans and the John Coltranes. They don't get reissued in the same way. Even the Albert Eilers and Archie Sheps and those guys, Pharoah Saunders that come later, they all have some of this development in their sound. And I think of all the great white players whose records go for good money, talking Bill Evans, Chet Baker, a few others, Giuffre should be elevated into that pantheon. He's certainly a highly developed, highly regarded composer, arranger, and player who played many instruments, and his impacts were widely known. His charts and his arrangements were definitely in demand, and you had all kinds of people playing Giuffre's stuff throughout the arc of his career. And listening here to Coltrane playing with Milt Jackson, and again, Milt's kind of bridling Coltrane's some. But Coltrane's still kind of working through his developments. And his prestige years with the sheets of sound and the endless lines of notes, and then the bit more focused sound at Blue Note on Blue Train, and then as he goes into his Atlantic years and Giant Steps is on the horizon, he's working modally with Miles. Coltrane's about to have his epiphany. And the issue with Coltrane is that he never stood still. Everything he grasped and had these aha moments, they were just the next rung in the ladder. And he hadn't gotten to the pinnacle yet, so he kept ascending that ladder and transforming his sound and what he was doing record after record, sometimes doing 3, 4, 5 records in a year. I believe in 1965 I counted 18 records that have come out from 65. First with the classic quartet, and then they of course started adding Pharoah Saunders and Rashid Ali and some of that stuff. They re-record. I believe it's the transition one is original and a second version of it. The second one gets put out, and the first one comes out later. There's all kinds of live recordings that came out in the late 60s and early 70s at Impulse that were from 65. So Coltrane's body of work in 65 is just an incredible documentation of a man's life for a year. It seems like he must have been non-stop having a saxophone in his mouth, which is incredible. But again, Coltrane there is sounding a lot like what we're hearing Giuffre doing at Atlantic, at Capitol, and at Verve in the late 50s, early mid-50s. And Coltrane, of course, is a giant. There's no diminishing his accomplishments and what he's about. But I would find it hard to believe that Giuffre wasn't part of that rung in the ladder and part of the innovation that he was hearing, along with George Russell's modal that Miles popularizes. And Coltrane was very instrumental in bringing that. And Giant Steps, of course, was one of the most complex but listenable pieces of music probably ever composed. And ultimately, the measuring stick of a piece of music isn't how complicated or how technical or how mathematical it is. It is how listenable is it. And if you can make it innovative and complex and mathematical, but still keep it listenable, that's the value that matters. Because innovation without purpose, without enjoyment, without listenability, isn't really that innovative. You can listen to the psychedelic rock era and hear how George Martin and the Beatles were being innovative, and it was wonderful in the ears. Then you hear the Stones' Their Satanic Majesty's Request, and some of those notes turn sour. Some of those ideas didn't have George Martin for one, but there was a ton of psychedelic rock that doesn't really work, and it was allowed to be released because that was what the cool thing was. So labels were putting out some pretty awful bands, honestly, and there was lots of independent record labels at those times putting out some of that stuff as well. So innovation, you can put a fifth wheel on top of a car, and you innovated, but what was the point? You know, innovation is only as valuable as it is useful and as it is listenable. And so listening to Coltrane, listening to Jimmy Giuffre, there's no question I think Coltrane was impacted by Giuffre. Even his approach to playing multi-instruments, that's something that Coltrane starts to embrace as well in 59, 60, 61, and of course he starts using the soprano sax and branching out into more interesting Eastern sounds and philosophies. And I think a lot of it, Giuffre, is kind of an uncredited impetus. You know, I mean, he's just kind of down there between the seams, impacting both the white jazz players and scene. And unlike most white jazz cats, Giuffre's impacting the black scene as well. People are definitely feeling the effects of what he's done. And he's creeping into the fabric of both camps on both sides of the river. And there's not a lot of guys from the white side of the jazz encampment that cross over to the black side of the river and make big ripples and impacts. But Giuffre definitely was one, and he definitely deserves more credit than he gets. And so that's my little John Coltrane versus Jimmy Giuffre. I have some more of his verb titles here I want to show you. Jimmy Giuffre plays 1, 2, 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The Jimmy Giuffre 3. That's a pretty tough record to come by. Another thing here on verb is the Jimmy Giuffre 4 ad lib. Another fantastic session. And then Thesis 8402 in the verb catalog is, I believe, also has another title to it. It's got a signpost with 3 directions on it with the 3 band members, and it's Paul Bly, Steve Swallow, and of course Jimmy Giuffre. And this Thesis record, and like I said, it has another version that was issued before this, is very, very modern, and the avant-garde's even more prominent on this than on what we're listening to. It was just Coltrane's sound on this that really made me want to do this episode. So check out Jimmy Giuffre, dig out his stuff, and buy them before they become more expensive. Because I think Jimmy Giuffre's records are kind of escalating in price by the year as more and more people recognize this guy's impact. And it's only a matter of time before Jimmy Giuffre's records climb into the $80, $100 range on a regular basis, which, like I said, some of them are already there. Luckily, they're not on Blue Note, so they won't be inflated by that label logo, which a lot of Blue Note titles are. You can have an artist make a record on Blue Note and make another record on Riverside. Similar lineup, similar sound, similar production, and the Blue Note title will go for 3 times what the Riverside title will. And some of that's just reputation now, and the collectors only knowing what's well publicized, which is Blue Note, which I try to undo that. I do think Blue Note's sacred ground. I never want to diminish what Blue Note is about. But I also think a lot of that sacred ground that Blue Note is lost on most of today's collectors. They're not buying it because of its unwatered down black explanation of their experience. They're not buying Blue Note for its integrity and its sheer blackness. They're buying Blue Note because it's hip and it's cool and it's what they've been told is important, and they want to show off to their friends. Oh, look, I have this old Hank Mobley. And you got to start somewhere. But Blue Note isn't what it is because of just the prices and the rarity. All jazz records are rare from these small labels. You know, Blue Note has ascended for reasons that are very unique. It was such a black-centered and focused label that there's no white artists recording on it after 1955. It's just black youth in their 20s, early 30s, recording not even innovative stuff, especially in the 50s. It's just aggressive and filled with an honest expression of black anxiety and frustration and militancy and the winds of change. You can't listen to Sonny Clark and those early Johnny Griffin records and not hear the winds of change. The demand that we be recognized as a people that are of worth and of value and have a lot to say, and we want to contribute to society, and we refuse to be glossed over and ignored. And while we appreciate what Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong did, opening these doors for us, we're going to take it one step further and go through the lobby and open the next set of doors, and we're coming into the chamber. We're coming into the building itself, and we will not settle for less. And there's a definite tone at Blue Note that is so ingrained in civil rights and so ingrained in the progression of the black experience. And it's that power, it's that message that is its potency. And it's so lost on 80% of the people who talk about Blue Note every day. You know what I mean? It's Rudy Van Gelder, it's Reed Miles, and all those things are important. But it's that fire-driven message of freedom at any cost that it's subliminal in nature. It's not verbally spoken. But the aggression, the tempo, the fire, the jazz messengers alone, it's a fist in the air. You know what I mean? It's definitely expressing something that's very unique. And so Blue Note elevating, it is justified, just not for the reasons why collectors think. It's not just about buying an investment piece because, oh, this record's going to be worth more 20 years from now, which it probably will be. But there's a social value and a commentary in it that, unless you have the context of history and the time it's being made and the progression of the black community as it was trying to integrate post-slavery, post-Jim Crow, this can't be separated. We can't hear this music without knowing the history that it's taking place in. This fabric has to be woven together if you want to understand the music, if you want to hear what they're saying. It's not just pretty notes. It's not just the blues. It's no longer even just about dancing and a good time. That was the last generation. This new generation is more resistant and saying we will be acknowledged. We will speak up. And I'm going to leave it on that. I'm going to show you one more thing. Hold on. I made an episode last week, maybe the week before, my 5 most wanted records. And I have managed to get one of those 5. I think the day after I made that episode, this one popped up on eBay. I probably paid a little bit too much for it, being that it's a second pressing, but it is in beautiful shape. It's the Yusef Lateef, The Dreamer. I got in the mail the other day, so I wanted to update that for people, so you don't have to keep looking for it for me. I know a few people actually were. This almost completes my Yusef Lateef collection. He did quite a bit of records at Savoy, 57, 58. There's now just one left. That's Stablemates that I showed you in that episode. That's half Sahib Shahab, is it? Or AK Salam, I think it is. But I just need to get Stablemates, and I have all Yusef Lateef stuff. And Stablemates will also complete my first 155 Savoys. So I need to find Stablemates at some point. Then I'll have that whole early Savoy library documented. And like I said, the more you have of a record label, the more you can comment on it. It's not just about knowing who the founder was and knowing where it was located and the logos. There's more to it than knowing even the progression of the labels on the records themselves. There's having the music and knowing the chapters of the label, what they were doing and who the musicians were and how they interwoven together and the coming and departing of musicians on the label. There's a lot of things you can glean from having a label's discography that you can't get just from a book or a documentary or just knowing the dates and the times and places. You have to kind of really dig in and sift through some of the chaff. You know what I mean? Savoy does have a lot of records that are reaches. Kind of talented white musicians that Lubinsky thought might make a dent. For the most part, they didn't. Most of them are still great players, but there's not a lot of demand for that, a lot of those records. And the records that he did make with young black musicians, those records are all so desired and have become very collectible. But this one, of course, was a tough find. Looked for it for a long time. I've seen copies for $300-400, which I wasn't going to pay that much for it. So when this one came in my lap, even though it's a second pressing with the oxblood color versus the red color, it's in beautiful enough condition, and my obsessive compulsive nature wanted it bad enough that I grabbed it. And so Stablemates now is the lone Savoy that I need to grab, and I'll be honest, I haven't even listened to this yet. I have a pretty good grasp of where Yusef was in 58, but I need to play this today. We've had my mother-in-law in town for the last 6 days, and so that's kind of preoccupied a lot of my time and my listening. And so she just left this morning, so we're now back making episodes and diving into records that are a little bit more intense. When Grandma's here, you got to play a little more of the vocal jazz and the blues-based jazz. That's not going to challenge too many frontiers, you know. So I got to dig through a lot of that kind of stuff. Something like Yusef Lateef probably has a little bit too much edge for Grandma to sit back in her rocking chair and knit me a sock. Probably ain't going to be her ideal cup of tea, as it were. So anyway, Jimmy Giuffre, is a guy that needs to be recognized. Buy his records. Check out Tangents and Jazz at Early Capital. You'll be surprised by what that record has to offer. There's some real dissonance, some real edge, some real modernity that Monk and Mingus, I think, would celebrate. Even Ellington would be like, wow, good job. It always manages to resolve itself back in melodic structure, which I think is always the key to making something work. When you abandon melody completely, you're kind of saying F you to the listener. I'm going to be very self-indulgent. And you have to, at that point, as a listener, choose to want to love it. And I get people kind of getting annoyed at me for saying that, but if you like the really radical, crazy, free, avant-garde jazz that has no melody, no rhythm, and it just kind of wanders and meanders, you have to kind of say, I want to like this weird stuff. I think it's me. I think it's who I am. And so it's a choice you make. And you want to know what that line is? When you play it for other people, how do they respond? If you play a record for somebody and eight people in the room go, this shit sucks, you like it because you chose to like it. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's plenty of records I've chosen to like that I know aren't going to be everybody's cup of tea. Neil Young's Tonight the Night, I love that record. Would I play it at the bar for people? No. I love the Frank Zappa Mothers of Invention's first three records. Absolutely Free, Rolling In It for the Money, and Freak Out. I think they're brilliant kind of takes on the whole hippie psych movement and a parody of America and its plasticity and the whole thing that's going on. Zappa's nailing it. He's in the moment nailing what's happening around him. Most people can nail something after it's not cool anymore, but to nail cool to the wall the moment cool hits, Zappa was very prescient. He was very aware of the joke that the machine was and how the big industry all of a sudden embraced all these clown shoe type records and artists and musicians and scenes that were going to make them money now. And so it was all a go. And how money was the bottom line always and always has been. And it's not just true in the music industry, it's true in every facet of life. Just watched this great David Cross thing last night. It was through some university study of Robert Call, but he was talking about the standard of living in America and freedom and the illusions of that freedom and how so much of what we think of as a nation with low taxes and high quality of living, it's actually completely untrue. And when you factor in healthcare expenses for people, we're actually one of the most highly taxed people on the planet. And he said that in the study, the average American spends 44% of their income on taxes for services they don't get, and then on a healthcare system that's incredibly inefficient. And it doesn't service the poor, and it doesn't service even the middle class. Most people's insurance policies, the premiums are so high they're not even usable. People don't go to the doctor because they can't afford it. And that's not what freedom is supposed to look like. So that's a great little thing as well that I wanted to share with people. I'm going to show it to my kids later. David Cross is a very funny guy, great actor. A lot of his performances in TV don't really reveal how intellectual he is. If you see some of his stand-up, you get to know David Cross a little deeper. But he's definitely a guy that's ingrained in social movements and philosophy and